So really appreciate everyone taking the time. My name is Shantanu. I help run Bits in Bio in San Francisco. For those of you who don't know, Bits in Bio is a community focused on bringing together folks that want to use software in science to accelerate discovery, development, really focus on people solving really the world's hardest problems. And we've been doing community events, both in person in San Francisco and 12 cities around the world. Plus, we have an online Slack channel and a newsletter. So if you're interested in using software in science, whether you're a technologist who's bio-curious, a biologist or scientist who's technology curious or bilingual, as some people tell me, we'd love to have you and find your people in the community. So today, we're doing a really cool panel around product. We have a esteemed panelist up here who's going to answer all your questions. I hear if you're if you're closer to the room, you'll be able to answer more questions, so feel free to move up if you'd like. But without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Vega, who will take us home. Round of applause.
Thank you. So welcome everybody to the Benchling headquarters. I just want to say a quick thank you to our sponsors. And also, one housekeeping announcement. We do have to be out of here at 8 o'clock. But if you are having a really interesting conversation, please bring it next door to a bar called the Fly Trap. We will meet people there after. So if you want to continue the conversation, join us there. All right, so with that, we'll kick this panel off. I'd like to introduce our panelists, starting with my far right, Grace Dharmaraja, who's currently the VP of Product and Marketing at Tierra Biosciences. She has a PhD in medical genetics and has a long history of working in life sciences. Most notably, Grace has led product teams at companies like Synthego, Natera, and Stem Cell Technologies. Next to Grace is Jack Morrell. He's currently a senior product manager at Resilience and was previously a PM at a biotech software company. He has a background in biochemical engineering and has previously worked as a bench scientist before transitioning into a PM role. Next to him is Mace. Mace is currently a startup advisor and consultant. She was previously head of product at Kintsugi, and before that she worked in product at Zymergen. Mace has experience working at the bench as well and has a PhD in genetics from Stanford. And finally, Masaki Imada, who is head of product at Invert. He has previously worked at Culture Biosciences and Genentech. Masaki has a long history of working as an engineer in synthetic biology, and he transitioned into product from a role as a fermentation engineer. Right? So with that, we're just gonna jump right in. The way this is gonna work is we have 4 broad themes for this panel, and then at the end, we're gonna open it up for questions from the audience. All right, so our first prompt, and we get this question a lot in the product management channel in the Bits in Bio Slack, is how to become a product manager, especially in the life sciences. So this is gonna be all about what led you to the PM path and what qualifications do you need to become a PM. So Grace, I'd like to start with you first. You've had a very interesting journey to your current role. You did extensive lab research as a grad student, and then your first role was actually in business development and sales at Precision Nanosystems. How did you transition to product management?
Thanks. So I didn't. The board dictated that I become a product manager. So we had secured a Series A round, and it was up to, they were basically, we were going through a reorganization, and our people were getting new definitions of what they were doing. However, from a more organic space, I was already kind of doing product management once we hired sales and VPs of sales and the field application scientists, and then I could kind of move away from having that completely external facing role. So I would say I was pretty fortunate that we had 5 a.m. and Telegraph Hill kind of tell us, you know, we want to model you. We were a Canadian company, model you a little bit more like the Bay Area. So I actually had no idea what product management was when I was given the title, to be completely honest. And I asked, you know, one of the co-founders, like, does my job change? He said no. So I was like, cool. We continue puttering along. But I continued to stay in it, though, simply because it was a perfect mix of science, commercial, and also seeing like what the actual scientists do with your product. So I continued in that role as I applied for things down the road.
Okay, Misaki, you're next. Same question to you, except you have a different journey than Grace. You went from an engineering role to product management. Can you tell us a bit about your journey? But even more specifically, I think what you do is software product management. Tell us a bit about that and how it's different or maybe similar to traditional, biotech product management.
Sure thing. I also similarly kind of stumbled into product management. I came from Genentech previously and had never actually really heard of product management at all. And when I moved into a startup, I worked at Culture Biosciences. I was working as a project engineer, helping translate our customers' needs into the work that they were doing in our labs. And eventually I burned out in the lab to a bit of an extent and wanted to continue to participate in the startup life. I realized that I was already translating the user requirements of what software we needed to build, what hardware we needed to build, and what types of services to provide. So I kind of straddled 3 different realms of product management from that opportunity. So very thankful to the faith that the founders had in me to take on that role. And since then have worked at product at Stratios as well as now at Invert. And in software product management, it tends to be much more understanding what the users need or want to build and want to buy. It's more of an external software type role. So we are continually learning, continually testing, and seeing product usage, talking to the users, and making sure that they enjoy the product.
Great, thanks. Mace, you're next on my list. So one interesting thing that comes up a lot, I've heard this description from many people, is the product manager is like the mini CEO of the product. I have mixed feelings about that description. Mace is in a great position because she's actually been head of product at a startup and she's been a product manager at a big company like Zymergen. Could you tell us a bit about, what your career trajectory was and how different was it going from big company, relatively big company, to smaller company?
Yeah, happy to share. And what a lot of what Grace and Masaki shared was also, I feel like no one ever starts out going into product management directly. Everyone kind of falls into it. It's usually a good second or third role. And then your question was around how does it look different from a startup versus a larger company? I think product is also one of those weird functions where it's one of the challenges of the role is that it's very or a lot of it is figuring out what the needs of the organization are for product. I've been in internal product management functions. I've also been in external product management functions, and it's really important that the PM function really goes at the pace of the organization and also fills the gaps that the organization needs. And so, at my last startup, Series A startup, I was in the digital health space, and one of the things that was really critical for the product was regulatory. And so, even though at a different company, regulatory is usually not necessarily part of PM always, but in my case, a lot of the role was regulatory and clinical operations because that was absolutely what we needed to do in order to get our product on the market. And in terms of the difference between product at a large organization versus a small organization, I've been in small orgs where our engineering team was 3 people and I sat across from them. And so, in that scenario, you probably don't need a super formal road mapping process. Probably just knowing what to build now versus later is good enough. Whereas when I was at a more larger established company like Zymergen, where I was the PM for 10 to 20 engineers and data scientists, you really needed to have more formal processes, a more formal quarterly roadmap planning process so that you could make sure that you were building the right things for the organization.
Thank you. Yeah, that kind of matches my experience as well from just going from startups to bigger companies. Okay, Jack, you're on my list as well. So you've worked at 2 very unique roles. First at a biotech software company and now at a CDMO. First, tell us a bit about your journey. And because you're my friend, I'm going to put you on the spot. I have a controversial question that comes up a lot. Do life sciences PMs need a life science background? Does it help?
Yeah, so a couple questions there. So I originally was doing solutions engineering at a software company, and I had two great people in my company who felt like I could make a big impact in our product team. So I like to say that they kind of pushed me into that. I didn't necessarily join willingly, but I did end up really enjoying it and feel like it made a big impact. So I think that's really a similar situation to what we've heard is maybe product finds you sometimes, or you don't necessarily walk straight towards it. You might just happen upon it because I didn't really know what product was, even in the early days of working at that small company, because product design, solutions, and some of business was all under one person. So it was really hard to differentiate like how those things are separate. But as we grew, I sort of grew into solutions and then moved over to product. I think at a big company, it's different. You usually have identified that you want a product type function, and it is reflected in your approach to how you want to do business, right? You want to treat things as products, or you already have products that you want to manage. So I think that like growth or development in that role is a lot more clear. Like you're coming in knowing what you're going to do, and you have a sense and experience from the past, and you know where you're going to take the role going forward. Obviously, like the company I'm at now has grown thousands of people more than when I started. So there can be like a lot of change that happens. But to kind of answer your second question, no, I don't really think people need a biology background. I think, as Shantanu said, like being bio-curious is really helpful. I just think there's definitely an element of you want to have mastery over mimicry. You don't want to just like mimic what scientists are saying. You really want to be able to master and understand what their needs are. So I think from maybe from like a traditional SaaS big tech kind of world, yeah, the background you bring doesn't matter, but you definitely have to have an understanding of the science when you come to sciences because the workflows are more complex. They're somewhat more immature from the digital space. And if you don't really have a bias for action or understanding of where science needs to go, you're going to really just you can be a PM who just listens to people and literally implement what they want. And oftentimes that's that mimicry, right? You need to demonstrate mastery and like that deep understanding of some of the systemic problems. Reproducibility crisis in science is talked about a lot. If you just listen to scientists, you're never really going to dig down to that unless you have a bio background and you understand that that's an issue that people are experiencing today. So in brief, no, you don't need it. It's very helpful. And if you don't have it, like take that skill gap very seriously and seek mechanistic understanding.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Also very diplomatic. I'm very proud. Great. So our next theme is about the role itself and also building in biotech. In my experience, product managers tend to have a wide variety of job descriptions as to what's required of you, and often you'll see this division of internal versus external product management in biotech. So the next question is about how much of your role is internal versus external, and how does it vary depending on the size of the company or what type of product you have. Mace, I'd like to start with you first. What was your experience like in your past PM roles? How much of sort of external, which could fall into sort of like PMM type role, duties, versus internal product management did you do?
I'd say I mostly did external product management. Zymergen was all internal product management. I think it's actually a very interesting trend you see in complex industries like biotech, where companies have a very complex platform that they're building towards. I know these days platforms are not as hot, especially for VCs, but there are a lot of biotechs that have very complex platforms, and it's super common these days to see biotech companies have kind of an extensive platform and a lot of PMs supporting those platforms. More on the external side, though, I think in some ways one of the challenges of the internal side is it's easy to get feedback, but it's hard to get direct feedback. Because if you work on an internal tool, everyone at the company has to use the tools that you build, regardless of whether or not they work well or not. Whereas when you're doing external PM, the clearest feedback you can get is, no, I'm not going to buy your product. It doesn't meet my business needs. So that is a clear distinction. And there are other challenges on the external side too, where I think when you're working on an external product too, you can't really be that honest with your users, so to speak. Like there's always an aspect of selling. Like you always have to kind of sell the product that you're working on, and that kind of brings into the more PMM angle. But I think there are pros and cons to both. Externally, it's also harder to get direct feedback, but also in a lot of ways, it's easier to justify the value of the PM function, where you can say, well, this because we shipped this product, this led to this much in revenue for our customers, and so it's kind of different worlds.
Yeah. Thanks. So same question to Jack. And just to reiterate, we're asking, what level of multitasking do you do in your role, and how much of it is external facing versus internal facing?
I think my current role is pure internal. I wouldn't call that marketing. I'd call it OCM, organizational change management, right? Because if you're onboarding a new tool, you want to impress upon the business the importance of adopting or using that tool if it's not an already established tool. That product that I'm working on now has been canceled / paused. So I now work on an external product, but I'm fortunate that the other product manager we have is like really great on that marketing and like external relationship side. So I can just purely focus on the internal side. So my my marketing skills are definitely not actively in use for any of the products that I've worked on. I do talk with our marketing team, but that's usually to sort of, again, be that PM type role where you're bridging the gap in knowledge, or you're sort of synthesizing and helping people understand how the technology and the business and the marketing relate. So really playing second fiddle to our marketing team, not really directly involved with them. Yeah.
Thanks. And then Masaki, similar question to you, but also, you're currently the head of product at Invert, which I imagine requires some level of external communication. How much of that multitasking exists in your role, and then especially when you're in a leadership role?
Yeah, definitely. At the moment, I think that you're primarily as a product manager, you're bridging a gap across departments. Depending on the industry that you're in software, you're typically bridging your users and your software engineers to really understand what to build. As I was applying to other jobs throughout my product management career, have looked at the needs and responsibilities for hardware teams, for molecular technologies teams, for pharma companies, for other like realms within biotech. And it really depends, if you're doing internal versus external, depends on what your company needs. If you're working on something that is hardware or something that you're selling as a physical concept, you're typically under the sales and marketing team and focusing externally so that you can get that product out the door. If you're working with a biologics company, there's a lot of internal product management that you do if you have software that you're building to support your own platforms. And since our software itself is external facing, we're selling to a variety of users. A lot of my job today is talking to them, understanding their needs, helping bridge that desired solution state to building something that is useful, and then getting the feedback on that and reiterating and testing that out across the board. And as the team grows, there are various levels of internal scaling support that we'll have to facilitate in terms of product to help the software team really be successful. If we were building hardware, like when I was at Culture, it tends to be more program management, where you're also bridging, hey, we need to build this thing, it's going to take X amount of months, we have to make sure that this is on schedule, what can we cut, how can we actually get this to be successful without over-investing all of the resources before realizing the value.
Yeah, thanks. And then Grace, last but not the least, you actually do have a true hybrid role. You're product and marketing. Tell us a bit about what that split looks like in your role, and tell us a bit about your past roles as well. How much of it was internal versus external?
Yeah. So I think I have a weird sort of outlook, which is basically, as I age, I don't want to travel anymore. And I think as you bring on younger product managers, is extremely motivating and very inspiring for them to speak to customers directly and see what folks are doing with our products. I think it also allows them to then bring that information internally and decide what markets to go into, what aspects to build, how to forecast eventually, all of those things that are more expected of senior level roles. So I tend to apply that whenever I'm a manager. So unless I have my own product, I would love it if I basically never travel. And so I tend to deploy those who are under me to go and enjoy conferences, really learn and kind of see what folks are doing. The difference, though, is that it doesn't always apply depending on the series, the size of the company you're at, what series stage you're at. So, for example, I just joined a very early stage company, which means I fully anticipate I'll be traveling quite a bit, which is different from my role of, a few companies ago where I had a fully built out team under me, as well as at Stem Cell. So I think that's kind of how I balance internal versus external. I myself will travel. So during my time at Synthago, because I had just came out of the pandemic and I was at Natera, which is a diagnostic company in a completely different space, I threw myself into conferences just to understand the market really quickly so that I could make decisions and make sure we're making the right decisions. So I did that just out of a learning need. So that's kind of been my external versus internal. I'll also say depending on the product you're working on. So Natera was a genetic testing company. Our products were the lab tests that we obviously sold to providers. There's a pretty hard wall between marketing and product in clinical-based companies, and there's compliance reasons for that. Additionally, there's one product you run that is operational and you basically become an operational product manager and you make efficiency gains for the running of that test. But when you're launching a test, that's kind of the only short period of time you get to be external facing, and you have to pay doctors to actually sit with you because it's all part of compliance. And then you have advisory boards of the launched products or kits, if you will. So very different than, for example, research use only products where I can call a researcher today and ask them, hey, how did you like, a product that you used at one of the companies I worked at? And that's the line is much more blurred. I actually tend to prefer being in the RUO space than in the clinical space for that reason. I like being able to have those multiple roles that you're talking about. If you want me to answer about the marketing and product fit as well, I think in the early days you do tend to have those together. Stem Cell did something interesting. It's 25 years old when I was there, but we actually had marketing under us at product. And then they pulled them out so that they could have a career path on their own for marketing. So that was really interesting to kind of see how that worked. It's the same at Tierra, and I think, longer term, I would consider doing the same, which is pulling marketing out and make sure it has its own path to climb.
Thanks, Grace. And that actually matches my experience a little bit. In some biotech companies, product reports up to marketing often. Yeah. All right, so switching gears a bit, I think we'll talk a bit about product culture and mindset in biotech. The PM role is relatively new in the field of life sciences. Even though it has existed in tech for a while, there are books written about it, there's courses you can do, there's a whole structure and philosophy around it. There aren't very many handbooks for how to do PM in life sciences. But I think it's something worth talking about because I think we're getting there. I think there's definitely this cultural shift happening. So I want to talk about how PMs fit into life sciences, and I think it varies depending on what product you work on. Masaki, I'd like to start with you on this. This is a very philosophical question. I think it comes up often in BIB conversations. If teams of scientists and engineers can get stuff done and can talk to customers, why do you need a product manager?
Like I discussed in the previous answer, I think it really depends on, the value of the product manager depends on what the company is going after and who your major stakeholders are. And I think the value of the product manager is to have somebody to really consolidate the information that they're seeing across different opinions in the market to provide some business impact analysis that might not be readily available from the engineers or scientists' perspective, and then be able to help make decisions and guide the progress of whatever product you're building. There's like the central role is around prioritization and justification around division of what are the things that you're building and why should anybody care. So it's you have to try to take all the information that you can find, whether that's from users, whether it's from people at your company, whether it's from your previous experience, or from a new industry that you're learning about or that's expanding in the space, and consolidate that to help the business grow. And so I think that there's a lot that the scientists and engineers can do. I think that there are a lot of companies that don't have product managers. A lot of software engineering companies tend to go productless. I think those companies tend towards products that are built for software engineers. So software engineers themselves are already users and understand the space fairly well, so they can drive that product fairly successfully. But depending on what type of company within the biotech realm you're talking about, the need of the product manager drastically changes.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. And sorry for the spicy question. Grace, same question, but with a twist. What I'm about to ask you has actually come up in other bib panels, but the last time we asked this question, it was to founders. When should a startup hire its first product manager? And how do you kind of explain the value,
Yeah, it's hard to answer that question, I feel. I think ideally, if the founder can listen to the customer and sort of synthesize what I think, we just heard from Masaki, like bring all that information in from various places, you're pretty good to go. Because you can do that until your volume gets big enough or your product offerings get big enough that you need a formal product manager to do a lot of that strategy and prioritization. The challenge is when you have folks who are building products for themselves as opposed to what the customer's needs are and don't really hear the customers, or they like sort of work in a silo. So it's a hard question. I think it's very dependent on the company you're at. So oftentimes, if you look at kind of what my path has looked like, I've been at quite a few companies. So I'm often looking at the leaders in that space to see if I'm even needed, whether, my role is even a role that's required. I think some of the larger companies, it's a no-brainer. You need product for various portfolios and you need to create some organization there. But for the smaller companies, like the one I'm at right now, Tierra is a perfect example of, if they had probably hired product a year or two ago, might have not, necessarily been the right time. While now we have a really good platform that synthesizes proteins pretty well for the current needs that we're getting from customers. So now it's about, well, what are the other features we're going to roll on? How do we make sure the customer, gets a product in a way that suits them, and all of those pieces. So I think it's a good time for it. Actually, I shouldn't say a year. It would have been too early. Maybe that's not the right thing, but maybe a couple years before it would have been too early. So I think it's very dependent on the company and the people that are currently making up that company. If those folks can step up and do a little bit of that, you might be able to, get the information you need to build the product in a way that makes sense and that will have commercial utility. But if you don't have that role filled, I think it's probably better to hire somebody sooner who can do that job.
Yeah. Next, I'm going to ask Jack a question. I think it's a similar question, but more about scaling up. So when companies become bigger, they inherently will require processes and how they do, product development. One, what's the PM's role there? And two, what do you gain and lose when you introduce these processes as you scale up?
Speaking as someone who was at a company that grew by thousands, I think sometimes the growth can just outpace the ability to make and hold on to processes. But I kind of think of my answer in like a slightly different way, right? I think if you have the product culture and you have, especially in science, there's this tendency to be very like service driven, things are very bespoke. You're not necessarily working to package your work because it could be throwaway. It's inherently an experiment, right? But you're doing your experiment for some purpose, like you're really focusing on, or you should be focusing on kind of the why and the what. And sometimes you lose sight of that and focus purely on the how. If you can keep sight on the why and the what, you can really build, I think, that product culture. And you may not necessarily have to have processes that scale with that, because that idea of packaging your work for reuse by others could be inherently baked into how people work. I feel like I see that right now, like different groups at where I work right now treat that very differently. Some groups are very good at packaging, some groups are very poor at packaging. So it's not really a great answer for like how processes scale, right? And I mean, probably don't have enough experience to give like the well-lived answer there, right? But I would think of it as like there are certain behaviors that you're looking to impress on people. I think processes are one of the areas of last resort. If you can't get that product thinking ingrained in your culture, you probably are following up with a process to make sure people follow up. I think of like portfolio management, maybe a good example, maybe not, but some of that's just keeping track of what's going on. Well, if people are being clear and transparent about what they're working on, why would you need to keep track of what's going on? Shouldn't everybody be well informed? To a point, yes. And then you're going to need a way to keep track of that, because you can't listen to everybody at every time. But you could easily have people putting their information into tools as opposed to having a role that goes and hunts those people down and adheres to some rigorous process, right? So I think you can approach it really from like, what is the behavior you want the tools to enforce versus do those behaviors exist today and do you really need the tools? So it's this very big sliding spectrum of like existence of behavior, existence of tools, and where they meet in between. Didn't really answer your question, but you could ask it again.
No, I mean, I think I agree with your answer too. I feel like it's more to, often processes are more to do with the company's culture and what they're trying to instill internally. Yeah.
Say like some processes are required. Like if you want to go do GMP validation, that's a process. There's a legal requirement that that exists, right? But you don't necessarily need like a process for processes. Like some companies have an SOP for writing SOPs and an SOP for writing SOP templates. I think that makes sense to a point, but there is an SOP for administering the SOP writing template for SOPs. And that's where process starts to just get way out of control.
Mace, I wanna tap on you next. This is I want to ask about your experience as a startup advisor and a consultant right now. What are you seeing in terms of product culture that Jack is talking about in the startups that you talk to, and do you see them kind of either hiring folks like you to fill that gap, or are they thinking about hiring product managers? What is the culture like right now?
Yeah, so I'll caveat that I focus more on the earlier stage, so seed, Series A. And at those stages, a lot of times product management is still super founder driven. And that makes a lot of sense because I think it is very much the founder's responsibility to really define the vision and get to product market fit. That's not something that someone on your team can usually do because the founders have a very specific vision of where they want to take the company. So, I mean, I think what I'm seeing, especially in the earlier stages, is that companies don't know when they can fundraise next, and so they are keeping teams super, super lean. You end up seeing what Grace was describing earlier, where you have several different people at the company taking on that product hat. Sometimes they'll bring in a consultant if needed, and that's where I would come into the process. But I would say these days, a lot of startups, especially in that early stage, are keeping things quite lean and really thinking about it through the lens of, how much runway do we have? How much runway do we need to get to product market fit? And what's our really keeping things lean until they can get to that next funding milestone, which may or may not happen for a lot of companies. Sorry to be such a downer, but that's what I've been seeing.
I mean, I think this audience like I feel like we have a lot of founders and folks that work in startups in Bits and Bio. So this is great information. um, all right, so the last topic is sort of a mix of I want to say like controversial hot topics that have come up on the Bits and Bio Slack channel that I kind of want to dive into, and then that will be the last question. After which we'll open it up to audience. So my first question is for Jack. We've had like multiple lengthy kind of discussions on the Bib Slack about whether or not like a PhD helps this role. Like, is it something you need to succeed? And in our panel, like, there's two people that have a PhD, and I would love for everyone to chime in. Really, like, is it something you actually need, or does it help you, or is it just another title?
But Vega, we can ask you the same question, right? It's like you're throwing this off. I don't have a PhD. I did biochemical engineering, and I was really big on techno-economic modeling and the cost value of money. So I proposed to my PI a financial model, and I treated like the knowledge as like the technology part, and I proved to her that it was not worth my time or my intellect to do a PhD, and she was pretty compelled by that, and she let me go. So I don't think the PhD is required in product, but I would kind of go back to like behaviors that you want to enforce, right? Like having a PhD means that like there is an amount of like grit and humility and work that you've put in to make something happen, right? Like you know what it takes to get shit done, and that can never be discounted, right? If your PhD is in like molecular biology and you're a PM at a software company, you're probably never really going to use that. I don't know what your PhD, molecular biology? Was I close?
It's in genomics.
Sorry, if your PhD is in genomics, like you may not really use that at your company, but like there's this deep domain expertise that you have a far larger toolbox than most everybody else who might come from like traditional tech SaaS who like has a degree in marketing and hasn't ever worked in the sciences, right? And that's not to discount those experiences, right? But that PhD gives you a well of experience to pull from. But like I said earlier, people can build that well from being biocurious. So I think again, like PhD is like helpful, but it's not really required. But it exists on that spectrum because some people like use it really well, and some people don't. So I think it's almost like there's that internal like self-determination of like how much do I want to use the knowledge that I have, right? Because you've worked hard for it and it's really valuable, so you should use it. But that doesn't mean that like externally it always has to be deployed. Like I think it's really case dependent.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to hear from other panelists. I think.
Oh, I definitely want to chime in. I mean, I have a PhD. I spent 6 years in the lab. I had one of those PhDs where I spent 4 years trying to find a thesis project, just lots of failure. But I think the thing that I took away from it is really trusting that scientific process. You know, coming up with a hypothesis, testing, that's something you do in product management as well. And it really gets hammered in, especially in the lab, because those experiments are very they take a long time, and it's not like I do software data PM now, and that it's definitely different time cycles and different levels of investment. So I think the PhD, I definitely agree, it teaches you a lot of grit. And also I think especially in the earlier stage companies and startups, I think having a PhD, having that background of being really comfortable with navigating ambiguity is really critical, where as a PhD student, a lot of times your experiments go in completely different directions from what you would expect, but that's just like a startup, and so it really equips you with a lot of tools to deal with, this is where the company is going, and these are the different steps I can take. I should give it this amount of time. It's just like any other experiment. And I'd say the PhD was also kind of a safe space too. Your PI had funding, you could do really interesting experiments and learn from that. Whereas in a startup environment, if you're founding something, then definitely a lot higher stakes, where you probably have a lot less time to demonstrate some traction to get more funding.
Yeah, I 100% agree with all that. Panelists, anyone else want to chime on this?
Say my piece. I
Yeah.
also have a PhD. So I think the more time I've spent since my PhD, I think it's getting less and less something I lean on. But definitely in the early days, just being able to speak to customers and them almost being able to speak that technically to you without having to really, you know, have half of it go over your head. And the reason I say that is because I did the Natera side of things, and I don't fully understand how lab testing to this day works, especially in this country. And so hearing from doctors what their struggles are with reimbursement and trying to get all of that coordinated from a product management side, half the time it's like I'm just writing notes. I was just really proud of my ability to transcribe well enough that I can go back into market access and be like, this is the problem, how do we solve this? So it was much harder, I would say, when it was out of my domain. And your domain is actually, so the cool thing about a PhD is whether you did it in genomics, whether you did it in, you know, all these other fields, biochemistry, there's a lot of transferability, I would say, in the experiments that you've done, the protocols, and like the tools that you use. So if you're ever building a tool, and even if it's in like software space, if you use software, I did my PhD so long ago, there's very little software in our world. Back then we kept physical lab notebooks. But so if you can now do all of that and have an opinion on it, I think that's a huge deal because you are the end user. So you don't necessarily need to go and speak to 50 different customers. Your gut is probably the same thing that they have problems with. So it made my job a lot easier when I'm in that space. Currently, I've never, you know, I haven't been in this is a biochemistry company basically, and I haven't been in that space since my PhD. And it's been so easy to be able to do this job just because I needed purified proteins during my PhD. So I don't necessarily need to go out there and ask those questions to customers. I can, you know, figure out whether this product is going to meet at least, you know, 70-80% of our needs.
Yeah, thanks, Grace. I knew people would have strong feelings about this. All right, so I have one last question, and then we'll talk to the audience. This one's more practical. In my past role as PM, the company swore by product management training, things like pragmatic. But then I meet people who also have really mixed feelings about that. They're like, you kind of learn what you need to learn at the job. I'd love to hear from the panelists on, like, are these boot camps useful? Do they teach you the right things, or are they just another thing you can put on your resume and that's how it helps? Yeah, go for it, Jack.
I actually graded some people who've come out of those boot camps and like graded their products, and I was like very impressed. I think some of these boot camps are only like 6 weeks long and they're not full time, and like there were people who came from like very diverse backgrounds that don't really have any sort of product orientation. Like someone was like, I worked like retail, right? Like I did back of the shop retail. There's very little like product management background that you'd get from that role, but they like made some amazing products around like this recipe management app that I was really impressed. So I think you can get a lot of those skills because I think you're just maybe shifting like your frame of thought to be more product oriented. But like there's so many frameworks out there. There's so many ways to do it. Like I don't think there's anything that's like the end all be all. You do learn it on the job, but like some stuff like product for product's sake or process for process sake, I think those phrases might start to sound the same. Like, yes, I have a 256 step to product development that I've made. Do I follow all those steps? No. If I even told that there was 256 to my team, they would just get massively upset, right? But those are exactly what they tell you to do in all these classes, like step one, do this, iterate this many times. But maybe it just comes from experience of knowing that like we can skip this step. Like you're saying, right? You're like, hey, I probably have the experience of 50 of these users, and like we don't need to go for 5 rounds of discovery and validation. We're good on round 1. We have a good sense of it. So it's probably a good like step, but I wouldn't put too much weight behind it. Although it's hard to get your first product job, so ... on like having that little certification.
Are really helpful. And, you know, I've been asking a lot of my team members from previous companies when they go do these things, let's just dump it in a G drive, because those are the things you really need at the end of the day. You could probably very organically fill in those templates yourself. You probably don't have to go to the course, but to have to make that template from scratch, right? Like just think about the forecasting models that you've made in Excel that's basically a macro. Imagine you can just get that macro and you can just like put stuff in. That's really, I think, the value a lot of those, you know, courses get you. And like Jack said, if you probably went to a larger company, so StemCell had like 30 product managers, you can imagine the layer of support that we had. You had your team lead, then you had all the product manager team leads that went into the, you know, associate director of product management, who went into the director of strategic marketing, who went into the chief commercialization officer. So you had like this entire group of people and then 30 of your colleagues that you could tap, right? And so it's much easier in a company like that's 25 years old, that has a ton of product managers that you can learn this stuff from. But I think it's nice when you're at a startup, if you go to some of these things where you just kind of learn very quickly, get some templates, and you're out the door.
I will say, like, I don't know about the Atlassian templates for like a PRD. They're very sparse.
That's a whole other panel.
I'm a big Atlassian fan, but I would say like some of the good product frameworks, maybe ignore that. Like, I think you can distill a lot of that down into like motivating questions, and that just like gets the gears churning, and it helps you like decide like what part of process or what part of template to make. And I worked with someone who had 10 motivating questions. They're just absolutely phenomenal. I cannot quote them to you because they're paragraphs, but like you don't need anything except those 10 questions and you could find your way. So like sometimes it's great to like mine from that pool of experience.
Overall, it gives you a space to be able to explore and learn and try that process in a way that is lower risk than trying to do that at your own job. I did a short course, Intro to Product Management, part-time, just so I could, when I was transitioning to product, like, what the heck is product? I've never really heard of it. Is it project management? Is it program management? What the heck is product? And it was really focused around being like a founder and doing discovery and talking to people, and it gives you just like the mental model of here are these people that you should probably go talk to and validate, because your initial gut might not be right, and exactly what they're saying that they want probably isn't right either. So can you develop a small app or something that people actually want, and what are the steps to go through that? How do you translate their vision into your vision and make that executable in a way that is kind of low risk? In my experience, I've seen people transition into product from multiple directions, whether it's because they were a founder and they were driving the product themselves, or they were a software engineer and they were tired of people who didn't understand software telling them what to do, and they wanted to do product management better. There are people from business school with an MBA going from the business side as a driver for, I know what people want to buy, I know how to sell something, I can defend the economics behind this product, this is why you should build this thing. And then there's people from the technical domain, whether that's software or science or something else with a PhD or not, in my case. But people tend to leverage the experience that they have in one way of product, and then tend to learn either on the job or through extracurricular learnings, a course, or there's so many books, so many blogs, so many Slack channels that kind of talk through the different processes. And I don't think any of them are necessarily correct, because there are so many different product type roles that exist, and depending on the company you're at, you're going to be approaching product in a different way. So it's more about how do you adapt and leverage the resources around you, how do you be resourceful to get to the end product.
Can you hear me?
Okay.
Great. I think we'll switch over to audience questions now. Yeah, we'll open it up to all of you, and I'll be your mic runner. So, okay.
There's no question too spicy.
Thanks. I'm curious about the reality that in the cycle of product development and bringing a product to the world. Biotech tends to move at the speed of biology. We'd love it to move faster. And software, there's a precedent that moves pretty fast, but like all this like physical liquid stuff that needs to grow or it just hasn't caught up. How do you, as product managers, deal with the drastically different expectations around how long these development cycles and feedback cycles and just all that stuff happens? And also, how do we make the feedback loop faster, just in general in our field?
That's like a triggering question he just asked, right? I don't. Go on, Chuck.
I don't think that we do enough of treating our science as a product, which I think contributes to that like slowness that you may be describing. I would, from experience and from looking over shoulders, very few scientists truly write a hypothesis and set an experimental design in place before walking to the lab. There's like a slapstick nature or slap together nature of how some of this stuff is done. And I think that contributes to this idea of slowness because that maybe disorganization in how the information is structured leads to like these friction points that can make the feedback cycle harder. So I think some of it actually comes from like how you organize your data and information to make those feedbacks of decisions, because biology is much more expensive than software, so you need to squeeze as much value out of it as possible. Given that we don't have a universal data model for biology yet, I would say that we're still going to be slower until we have something like that in place. But again, that's a probably contentious topic on its own.
And I mean, we can look at other industries like hardware products as a good analog, where there are other industries where it just takes longer to get through the cycles. I don't think that's a bad thing. It's just the nature of the cycles of building a product in that space and how quickly and how much you can iterate, where if you're working on an FDA regulated device, there's not, the iteration cycles are going to be much longer because it's highly regulated. So I don't see it as, I think it's important to iterate at a cadence that makes sense for the product, but I think there's also a lot we can learn from other industries like hardware.
I think there's also an aspect of trying to figure out what you can de-risk along the way. How much can you break down into smaller steps so that you don't have to build the entire bioreactor to be able to see if it's going to work or not? You can test the thermal system and other small components and make sure that you have a pathway to success so that you don't have to wait till it's all built and then say like, okay, all the cells died. Why did that happen? And it really depends. Like for biology, you're developing, maybe trying to develop a platform for stem cells or trying to do organ models. You're going to be stuck at the pace of the data that you can generate. But there's also potentially other ways that you can accelerate that through data mining of other sources that already exist in smaller experiments that you can run that don't rely on the full model being available.
You have to break it down into like pieces that are more digestible. You should also try to see if you can use that data for marketing and other purposes. So whatever you generate at the bench shouldn't solely be for the purpose of, developing a product or moving a product along. That data should be being collected for purposes that are outside and external facing, because it's hugely valuable. And you don't have to make the scientists do that again. I think that's a lesson I've learned time and time again. The other part that I've also noticed is we're in this weird transition of where you have a generation coming up that probably did a lot more things through automation, and versus like my generation who had like zero automation, and it's like this weird divide. So as a product manager, I think you should keep an eye on how the science is actually being done. If you can either add automation or you can farm it out, because there's experts who do this as a regular thing that you don't need to be the one doing it. Like, it's not part of your mission and vision at the company. You don't need to build that expertise. You should consider, relying on experts that are out there to use their expertise, and then you get the data faster as well. So I think those are like, you don't have to have everything built at that company at that time. You can work towards it, but it doesn't need to be, you know, in the early days. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for like the insightful discussion so far. I just had a question that I'm sure probably came up in the Slack channels, I'm a bench scientist aspiring to be a product manager, and had a question. So when I go to apply to jobs, and they always say like, you know, you need 1 to 2 years of product manager experience in the minimum, and you're like, you need to get into the role in order to, you know, start your experience in sense like, because a lot of the learning is done on the job. You know, you need to actually be in the job to get that like minimum amount of experience so that you can apply. So how, you know, I'm sure this probably asked before, but just kind of representing other aspiring product managers who are also here, how would you navigate the situation? Like, how would you communicate that you can learn on the job pretty efficiently and, you know, kind of like get your first product management role?
It's always so tricky getting your foot in the door. You know, I think one piece of advice I give a lot of aspiring PMs is if it's possible at your current organization to take on roles that have a lot of PM components. I think it's much easier, especially in the climate right now, to be able to do it at your current organization, if at all possible. And I think it's also important to know yourself and how you best learn. So some people learn very well by taking courses like we discussed. There are other people who learn better by doing. And so it's also really knowing, you know, how you can learn best. And I think, you know, you don't have to necessarily have that official title of product manager to have product management experience. I think that's something super important to remember and be able to kind of figure out what are those stories that you need to get, what are those experiences you need to get, and see, is there a way as a bench scientist that you can maybe tag along on some projects with your existing PMs in your organization.
I would add, like, you know, that behavior of being product minded that we've talked about, like bringing that to your organization if it doesn't exist, is like a very impressive talking point during like that networking and resume or cover letter, because you don't say like, I was handed tools and frameworks, which are great, right? But like, I brought them to my company. I did the change management. I did the marketing. I helped my team improve, right? I didn't just do, like, I educated, right? So you can make yourself a product manager, if that makes sense, by bringing it to your team. I think there's a lot of parts of science today that aren't treated like products, but could be. So there could be a ton of opportunities in any role that you have today to make that impact and gain that kind of experience without having the direct title.
This one is for seasoned product managers that want to go to a leadership role in product. Do you think there's a skill that made you get there? Or do you think it all can be learned by experience?
I don't know how to answer this. I have to think. Somebody else want to go first?
I mean, actually, like managing a team, managing a PM team is very different from being a PM. And I think one of the challenges with leadership is being very clear in terms of roles and responsibilities of your team. It's very tough to work in an environment where the roles and responsibilities are kind of mixed, where you really want to make sure the decision-making power is clear, where, you know, I've definitely run into situations where, you know, especially at startups, where the founders don't necessarily draw that boundary very clearly, and you end up in this kind of like ping pong effect, which is, you know, challenging for the whole team. That leads to a lot of burnout, where, you know, you go back on decisions. So I think I think a lot of it is also learning on the spot. You're going to have a different kind of a style depending on who your team members are. And I'd say as a product leader, your team also becomes more your cross-functional partners in addition to your own team as well. And it's challenging kind of being in a leadership position because you're both managing your immediate team, what they do day to day, but then you're also thinking about the bigger picture of how do I work with the sales team? How do I work with the CEO? And really figuring out, how do I get the resources I need for my team? How do I make sure the work that my team is doing is really showcased? So I think it's a different mindset. Whereas when you're a PM, you're thinking about, okay, what do I do for the product? A lot of people make this analogy that I like, where when you're in a leadership position, you're more of a manager. You're kind of, conducting an orchestra. Whereas when you are the PM, you kind of get to do the on the ground work. You're the artist, and so I think that's been a way that a lot of people have thought about it as well.
Sorry, can you ask your question again?
Yeah, so for seasoned PMs that are working, let's say in software or biotech, of course, what do you think is the skill that helped you get into a leadership role? Or can everything be learned?
Right. I think it's a lot more qualitative, probably, is the answer. So I became a team lead at Stem Cell after I went in as a individual contributor, and I had my own product category. I actually had to still continue to own that product category even while I was managing, 1/3 of the revenue portfolio. So with my other product managers. So I would say that I think if you can show leadership as an IC and independence, and product's really easy to do that because it's not necessarily like research where you have to kind of report up your results and your findings and then sort of the lead goes with it. So if you're fortunate enough to have a team lead who, puts you on a pedestal, allows you to have that ownership, and you can show your independence because, like Vega was kind of mentioning, you're almost the CEO of that product portfolio. And if you can show that product portfolio to be successful with your, innovation, your ingenuity, the way you're managing it across all the different teams that were just mentioned, then I think that's how you come to the surface. So a lot of my leadership opportunities that I got were actually solely because they had known me from previous opportunities. So always think that as a product manager, you're always in the forefront. The limelight's on you in a very weird way. So that means when you're performing, it really helps you for the subsequent jobs and opportunities that you're thinking about. So today, at your place right now, that opportunity might not exist, but in a couple of job jumps, you might see it suddenly pop up. As a perfect example for me is I exited Synthago as a team lead. I went as an IC to a job in between. And then the previous chief commercialization officer at Synthago is the CEO of Tierra Biosciences. Why do you think I got the job, right? So I think that's a way to sort of think about it, is that you're creating this network of people who will eventually become leaders, and then they'll kind of tap on you because you've made that portfolio successful in their eyes, and you're memorable when they worked with you.
Thank you.
And I think an important thing to consider is, do you want to manage people? A good product manager does not make, being good at product management as an IC does not necessarily make you a good people leader in terms of managing the organization and the requirements that they have and enabling your team to provide their best leverage for the work that they're trying to do. And it's completely okay to not go into management. I feel like it's talked about across many industries of you have frustrations with your manager because they suck at managing people. Sure, they were great in the lab, they're a great scientist, and they deserve recognition, but probably should be maybe a principal scientist instead of a people manager. So I don't think you necessarily have to jump into becoming a people leader if that's not something that you want to do.
Thanks for a great panel. I have a practices question, or kind of like a tactics question. So you've touched on a couple times taking big problems and big questions and breaking them down to little pieces and testing them rapidly, right? I'm curious, how often in biotech you see that truly being possible? And in the cases where you can't break something down, how do you approach when you have to take that leap of faith?
Repeat her question. I'm not gonna do that again.
Spoke to this earlier.
Well, Michael. Sorry. Who is on my team? I mean, really, for the things that are innovation, there is the opportunity to justify the cost of the research, trying to figure out what that value proposition is, and then seeing where you can test it along the way. There's always going to be cool innovation opportunities or very shiny things that your CEO may be like, okay, where is AI coming into the picture here? That is not going to have maybe immediate results, but will have some longer form vision. And it goes back to cost versus value of, can you justify the bet that you're taking? And if you can't collect the data along the way, are there people that you can lean on? Are there other people that have approached this problem before? And can you ask them? I don't have all of the answers, obviously, but I'm happy that there are people who are also in the product space or even outside of the product space who have attempted feasibility of certain concepts and whether or not they'd be interested in doing it or using that product or buying it.
I like to say the word modularity a lot. But I mean, I think that that's true. If you're bringing like a therapeutic asset to market, like you're bringing an antibody, bringing Herceptin to the market. Yeah, you that's a monolith. You could move on faith, but someone's done the market research to treat that product as something that's worth bringing to market. But as you go to like develop and commercialize that, you can't just take that antibody and go from step A to like B. You really have to like decompose that monolith down into all like its subsequent parts. And each of those parts are potentially products. If you think about unit operations from like a chemical engineering perspective, those have defined inputs and outputs. They have specifications. They behave in a certain way. They do start to like, if you squint your eyes, they do start to look like products. And you could treat each of those individual unit operations of your therapeutic process as individual products. And if your bioreactor is really successful at growing CHO cells, it might be great for growing CHO cells for all your other products in your pipeline, your therapeutic products, which means that if you treated that bioreactor as a product and as a module, then you might be able to expedite and better move on a future therapeutic asset by understanding the portfolio of pseudo products that exists in your pocket today, right? So I think there's an element of like looking at things a little differently and seeing how much you can break it down. And of course, you're right. You get to a point where you can't break it down. But I think that's where you pull on like domain experience and like existing trends and examples. We modularized semiconductor manufacturing, cars, nuclear reactors, homes, airplanes. There's nothing to say that we can't do it for some of the more biofocused things that exist today.
So I've been sort of tangential to product and my business development function for a number of years. And the problem that I see a lot is you get pulled into the direction of your biggest customer. How do you balance that with the needs of all of your customers in the product management role?
Sure, I can. I mean, I ran into this at the first startup that I was at, where we had an early Keystone customer, and I think it emphasizes the importance of having a product management function. If you're a sales-driven organization, you're always going to follow the money, and I think that's important. But and there's nothing wrong with being a sales-driven organization. At the end of the day, revenue is revenue. But I think if your goal as a company is to build something repeatable, a product for multiple customers that you can serve and scale to, then that's where it's important to not over-index on your first main customer. And that can be really hard too as an organization, especially if you're used to serving the needs of that customer. But it's important to go out there and validate that early, because there can be things you're over-indexing for that one customer, and you realize some of those things are, this is really custom, unique to that customer, as opposed to something that's more generalizable for the industry. So at the end of the day, it comes down to, are you building a more consulting-esque business with a lot of customizations, or are you building something that's more product-centric that you're focusing on scale?
I think there's also an opportunity there to enable a solutions engineering organization that can help drive through the development of more bespoke types of additions to the product. But it's a conversation between the sales team and the product team to understand where does it fit in the larger roadmap, does it at all, and how robustly should this be kind of developed now versus later, and how can that evolve? Because it may have potential once you build out the product in other spaces. But there is also that kind of trap of consultancy evolution or de-evolution into consultancy. But that brings up a nice kind of conversation topic we haven't really touched on today, which is productization. So I'm curious from the rest of the panel of, like, in your experience, how have you approached going from maybe a technology that your company has to getting it into, or scaling it as a product?
So we did this at Precision Nanosystems, Ilya. I don't know if you noticed, but we had the services arm that Kevin ran for the purpose of understanding new products that we could productize, but provide it as a service. And so you could actually charge, 10 to 40x more because it's a white glove service. And your target is very specifically pharma, obviously, in that case. And then you productize it to make it more democratized and accessible to everybody else. That's actually why the 1 year P&I didn't double. It was saved because of that. And then the next year it did double. So that's a very common path I've used in a variety of my roles is, especially in startups when you don't know, you kind of have that services arm. That takes a lot of discipline from the company because obviously the co-founders just want to take in everything. So you want to be able to, really have a bit more of a leash on that and not just open the floodgates. I think that's very key so you don't go down and take on projects that you can't really deliver on. You really want to do a good feasibility process, and to Kevin's credit, he set that up very well at Precision Nanosystems. I will also say, I don't know if you were there when I did this, but 50% of the kits that we had on the market, I sunsetted because I just thought it wasn't worth making it because we made it solely for Genentech. So, I think that's a really hard decision to make. Those were tears in James's office to get that out, to get it off the shelf. But I think sometimes you just have to make that decision that you've just made a product that no one else wants except that one company. And you can continue to make it as a custom kit for them if you wanted to, and we just drove up the price in order to do that. But those are some of the hard decisions you have to make when the market numbers don't add up.
Thanks, guys. So it's probably, hopefully, non-controversial to say biotech's in a bit of a downturn. And so I'm sort of curious how product development from your perspective has changed as a result of this. Like, how has what your customers are asking for, like, how has that changed, as a result of the environment they're in? How you approach product development, how is it different? Is it different? I'm curious for multiple opinions.
I think the major thing is around figuring out your total available market and really punching into who's going to be paying for what and making sure that you're talking to the right buyers. If right now, especially, there's probably more stringency around budgets. So if you're just talking to somebody as a bench scientist who finds that your product is useful, that's great, but it might not be able to get through the budgets at the end of the day. So are you providing value at a higher level throughout the organization that can really drive savings or operational improvement that helps that company stay stable or pushes their progress through the rough market times?
I mean, I think I come from a somewhat place of privilege. I have a little bit of insulation on that because we're working on something that's maybe farther out. But something that we talk about a lot is like, how could we take bits and pieces of what we're developing today and take it from like a 2045 release, right? And say like, is there a small unit of value that we can give out like next year to an early access customer and have people pay for that, right? So I think kind of to answer your question, some of our conversations are about like trying to pull off smaller valuable pieces that still keep the product moving in the right direction. But thinking about how those pieces could be managed and split, but still contribute to the overall product, right? I can't really like give a great example, but it's harder for a therapeutic asset, right? You can't like just take a fab off of your main antibody and be like, oh, we're going to sell this. Like that doesn't work like that. But I think for some of these like med tech or software type things, I think that there's possibility there. I think we see it with like bio platforms or just platforms in general. You probably shouldn't be selling or making a platform play until you have a couple of examples of things working before they go through the platform. So like that's a good example of like, hey, let's take a step back on the platform, think about an individual piece that could be run through the platform, keep that platform internal, put that piece out into the market, right? We can still manage that as a product and it will prove or disprove if we should continue spending money on this very big platform that is potentially very expensive and doesn't take us anywhere.
Definitely agree with the platform comment. A lot of founders I talk to, even though they set out originally to build a platform business, have really pivoted to, being more product or agent focused. So I think that's been a dynamic I've seen is you can't just do platform for platform's sake. It has to lead to something that can get to the market.
And I don't say this from experience, but like secondhand, a true platform that actually works as like a platform or a two-sided marketplace, there's very few that are successful. They're very hard to build. They're very expensive. You probably won't be successful. It's just the numbers, right? So like, don't jump to a platform first. Pick something else. Good platforms are hard. They're very hard. There's a great book on it called The Platform Revolution that was written by some Nobel. I think they're economists. Vega's reading the book right now. I think it's a good study of like, it's hard. Maybe pick something else instead, but there's still value in it. Just be careful. Yes, I love it.
You're welcome.
So speaking about resources for the audience, you mentioned there's courses and things, but can you give more explicit recommendations on people, platforms, books, things that have shaped your learning or things that you're excited to read or talk to? That's for everyone.
I guess an author I really like following in the product space is Deb Liu. She's the CEO of Ancestry, and she's a fantastic writer. Of course, she comes from more the tech background, but I think she writes a lot of great pieces on how to do product management well, gives a lot of frameworks and different ways of thinking about managing careers. So I always recommend her as a resource. The second group is Women in Product is a fantastic group. I'm pretty active in it, and it's a really great community, especially for women in the space to connect with other PMs and talk about different challenges they have. We have a super active Facebook group where people, talk about all the different problems they have, and people can be pretty honest about, these are different things we've tried, and it's a fantastic community.
In terms of spaces, there's the Lenny's product newsletter, but there's a associated Slack channel. I don't necessarily stay up to date with all the things coming out in the newsletter, but it's a great place to be able to vet ideas, find other people who have had similar experiences. So I think networking is a big part of it. I don't have any particular authors that I could recommend at the moment, but always looking to see what the hot takes are and seeing if they'll work out in my practice or not.
Yes to both of those answers. I go on Reddit, and I think that's maybe funny, but not like, I'm really curious about people on like, e.g. the product manager Reddit subreddit. I don't really know Reddit well, but like, it's a place for people to bitch and complain, right? So like I find that a very interesting resource because in some way it's telling you what these tools are missing or where people still have questions. And like I think if you're thinking about like really mastering or building up skills, it's important to know like really good vetted information. I go to both of those sources. And where people think that there's gaps, because that tells you like it's a gap in the market that you could fill with your knowledge, or it's telling you that you're not the only one, and that's like it's validating that it's not a resource in a way. Like knowing the resources and the non-resources, I think, are both valuable. So I like try to look at the in-between spaces too.
I'm gonna add a couple resources. Obviously, you should join the Bits and Bio product channel. Because then you can hear about events like these. The other thing I would recommend in my last role as a PM, the company had like funding for a course. Take an in-person course if you can, and then the actual social events or networking that happens from that is very, very useful, potentially more than the actual course. So I took one at Haas, the business school at UC Berkeley, and the people I met from there it was way more impactful than like the actual material of the course.
Stanford has a good
yeah.
one too. Yeah.
Yeah, I took the Haas one too. I think it's the networking part that works. I'm not going to say anything that's going to be that you guys want to hear. So I read papers, publications. Unfortunately, I'm still a dweeb, so that's probably the majority of my intake. And then I'm mostly doing podcasts on like human behavior for my own growth, but also things like Luke Timmerman, I think, is a great podcast on understanding, because he speaks to CEOs who have gone through ups and downs. And so you can hear about some of those challenges that they've faced, and they speak about it pretty openly. So,
Great, guys. So, round of applause for the panelists. So we're here till 8 o'clock. Drinks and food are back there. Feel free to come up. Everyone will be here mingling, and then we'll head to the fly trap afterwards. Thanks, everyone.